You may or may not have heard, but there's a new programming language in town, and it promises to be simpler than Python, and it approaches the performance of assembly language. It's called Mojo, and it's a superset of the Python programming language. And if you're into AI, if you're into data science, if you're into machine learning, it behooves you to learn about this new programming language. Hi, I'm Cameron McKenzie. I'm the editor-in-chief over at theserverside.com, and I want to show you a few things about this new programming language. The first of which is going to be just how to install it on a Windows machine. And I know what you're thinking. Windows? Yes, Windows, because I want this to be an egalitarian experience where everybody can enjoy Mojo, and being able to install it on Windows just kind of opens up the ecosystem to everybody. But we're not going to just install Mojo. What we're going to do is we're going to create the compulsory hello world, but also take a look at a little simple program that we can write in Mojo that shows some of the differences between Mojo and Python, and maybe even some of the ways that it resembles Java. But in order to do that, we need to get Mojo installed first. And the first thing we need to do that is install the Windows subsystem for Linux, which is the first thing that we're going to do right now. To install Mojo on Windows, you can just follow the instructions on the Modular website. But if you follow them to the T, you might run into a couple of problems. There's a few steps that are left out. So I want to actually go through these instructions for installing Modular and Mojo, point out some of the pitfalls, fix them, and get us up and running with Mojo quickly. Now, in order to run Mojo, the first thing you need is the Windows subsystems for Linux installed. You might already have it. Open up PowerShell and just type in WSL-L-V. If that returns the name of a distribution like Ubuntu, well, that tells you that, yeah, you know what, you've got WSL installed and you've got an Ubuntu distribution. If you don't have an Ubuntu distribution, I would recommend going to the Microsoft Store and just installing the latest one. That's the one that we're going to use in this instance. I personally don't have the Windows subsystems for Linux installed at all. So I got to start from scratch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up PowerShell, but I'm going to open up in administrative mode. Make sure that when you open up, you right click, you select Run as Administrator, and then open up PowerShell with elevated rights. Otherwise, nothing is going to work. When it opens up, just type in WSL-install, click Enter hard, and it'll take a couple of minutes, and the Windows subsystems will install. Now, when it's done, it is going to require a reset. So reset. When it starts up, you'll notice that a terminal window automatically pops open. It'll say Ubuntu in the top left-hand corner there and say we're installing. This may take a few minutes, and indeed, it might take a few minutes, so be patient. After a few minutes, what's going to happen is it's going to come up and it's going to ask you for a username and a password. And this username and password doesn't map to your local operating system or anything. There's actually a username and password that's going to be used internally inside the Ubuntu instance that's being provisioned for us. I'm going to type in my username, Cameron MCNZ. That's my Twitter handle. So go follow me on Twitter, sign up for my newsletter, find me on LinkedIn, subscribe on YouTube, all that other stuff. Got to provide a password. I'm not going to tell you what my password is. And once we're done that, well, boom, all of a sudden we've got the Windows subsystems for Linux installed. Next, we now just got to install Modular into Ubuntu and then do a couple of configurations to make things work. And then we can install Mojo. Now, the instructions for installing Modular and Mojo on the Modular website are quite ambitious. They actually start off by telling you to install VS Code and a whole bunch of different plugins, and then install Modular and Mojo. That's too much for me. I just want to get Modular libraries and Mojo installed. So the first thing I'm going to do in my WSL instance is copy this piece of code from the website that tells us to curl Modular, provides a token ID, and allows us to just basically get the Modular environment installed. So I paste that in, token and everything. I think I need to provide my password because it requires elevated rights. And this gets the modular subsystem installed. Again, Modular is the company that makes Mojo. So it's kind of their subsystem that gets installed right now. Now, after this is done, I always like to query the system, make sure that Python is installed and see what version we're working with. I believe it's going to be 3.8. The other reason I like to do that, I like to make sure Python's installed. But the other thing that's funny is if we actually follow the instructions on the website and follow up this step with a Mojo install, we'll end up getting an error. So let's check the Python version. It's Python 3.8. So Python's installed. So let's do the next step, right? What is it? Modular install Mojo. Keep your fingers crossed. This should work. No problem. We've got Python. We've got Modular. And boom, all of a sudden it's going to come crashing down on us and say, hey, you don't have the Python virtual environment installed. That's okay. It indicates to us we just need to do an apt install Python 3.8-v env. I'm good. I can do what I'm told. So just type that in. Keep your fingers crossed. Apt install Python 3.8-v env. Give a virtual environment. Click enter. And then boom, once again, it doesn't work. It's like you need elevated rights. Okay. Let's get sudo out here. Sudo apt install Python virtual environment. Fine. This gets done. Now it's like, okay, we're good now, right? Like, let's just do that install Mojo command. So we just Control L clears the screen. We copy that modular install Mojo command. And, well, this error's out too. I don't exactly know why this error's out, but some of the tomfoolery that we just did apparently really annoyed Modular, and it says it wants us to run a modular clean. Again, I do what I'm told. Just type in modular clean. That's it. Control L, then modular install Mojo, and then that's it. So there's a couple of hiccups on the road. As I said, you follow the instructions exactly, things get out of kilter a little bit, but if you just kind of roll with the punches, you'll get it installed. And so there you go. It takes only a moment. Once it's installed, it looks good. You notice it says enter Mojo to start the Mojo REPL environment. Don't do that because we actually have to run the commands above that first. You have to just set an environment variable and set the path. Then you can actually run Mojo. So we're not quite there yet. Now, by the way, I don't like copy and pasting from this terminal window. So over on the Modular website, you can actually find the instructions to configure the modular home. And then after that, you can add the modular libraries to the path. So it's going to copy both of those, paste those in, then type in modular -- version and pat myself on the back for a job well done because Mojo 05.1 is installed. The next thing we're going to do, a little bit of REPL in our Mojo environment. So now that we've got Mojo installed, what we're going to do is we're going to play around a little bit in the REPL environment. It's like a command line environment where you can type in commands and test things out. It's not a true Mojo type of programming environment, but it's a great way to test out the language and test out the APIs. And in order to do it, all you have to do is just type in the word Mojo, and you'll notice the REPL environment comes up. From there, just type in print, round bracket, double quote, hello Mojo world, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, and double quote, curly bracket, round bracket, click enter twice, and that'll force that code to execute. It'll say, hello Mojo world, and you have just written your first Mojo program. Well, it's the Mojo REPL environment, but that's close enough. It's an accomplishment. But you know what? I thought it might be nice if we actually did something a little bit more interesting, a little bit more Mojo. One of the things I like to do is I like to show you how Mojo uses data types, right? How it uses strict typing. Here, I want to create a program that declares a variable of type int. In order to do that, I just type out var x colon int with an uppercase I, pronounced it with an uppercase I, equals 10. So now I've declared a variable of type int named x, which is equal to 10. Then the next line of code, I go x equals x plus 10. So that should take it up to what? 10 plus 10, take it to 20. And then finally on that next line, it's just a print x, click enter twice, and boom, all of a sudden it prints out the number 20. So there you go. Now we're using that REPL environment, but we're also actually using some of the cool features of Mojo, that var keyword and the ability to declare variables of specific types. Now, as I said, that's a REPL environment. So why don't we actually create a file and develop an application? So I'm just going to create a file on the file system by doing touch hello.mojo. That will just create a file on the file system named hello.mojo. You can see that when I do an ls command. And we're working on the command line inside Ubuntu, right? We're not using VS Code. Like, we're doing like low-level development here. In order to open this file, I'm going to use a tool called Nano. So I'll just type in nano hello.mojo, and then my Nano editor comes up. The first thing I'm going to type in is fn main round brackets colon. And this is interesting because if you're a Python programmer, you're used to def, right? def before a method is defined. Here we're using fn to define the function. They're a little different. Def actually still works in Mojo, but if you want strict typing, if you want safe operations, you got to use fn. Python Mojo won't enforce it unless you use fn. Also, the main method, right? Java has a main method, and C++ has a main method. Python doesn't have a main method. Well, Mojo does. And essentially the main method maps to the if name equals main construct in Python that you may be familiar with. This is the entry point of your application. Whenever you have an application that needs entry point code, the code goes in here. And so what are we going to do in here? Well, why don't we just do what we did before, right? Declare a variable. I'll make the variable Z or Z. I don't know if you're Canadian or American, doesn't really matter. Make it a variable type int, uppercase I, make it equal to 1, then add 5 to it, print it out. And once I've written all that code, I'm going to do a Control-O, which saves the file, Control-X, which exits me out of Nano. Trust me, I'm not a big fan of writing code in Nano. Then I can go back to the terminal window, do an ls just so you can see hello.mojo is there, and then just run the program. Type hello, type mojo, hello.mojo. That runs the program, and you can see that the output is the number 6. So now we've actually just run the program right there from the command line, running code that we just wrote into a text file. So essentially creating a Mojo application. Now, there's a couple of other cool things that Mojo can let you do. If you actually type in Mojo build hello.mojo, it'll actually create an application for you. If I do a little ls command after issuing that, you'll see that there's a file there named hello, right? That's your actual application that's been created. And then you can just do a /hello, and boom, all of a sudden it prints out the number 6 because it's just taken that application that has been taken your code, which has been packaged as an application, run that application and generates the output. And there you go. Those are just some really super cool things that you can do with Mojo after the installation using the REPL environment and by actually going in and creating applications, building them, and creating artifacts that can actually be executed at the command line. Very, very cool stuff that we can do in Python. The last thing that I wanted to do was show you a little application that uses conditional statements, declares variables, has loops in it, uses some Python-like structures, and just executes at the command line. I think that'll be a good whirlwind of how Mojo works before we sign this thing off. Before I do that, I just wanted to mention we're working with a young freelancer named Darcy DeCluch. She wrote this great book, Scrum Master Certification Guide. If you do Scrum or you're Agile or you know somebody that does, pick up a copy. It's over on Amazon. I also wrote a little book called Pickering of Springfield 2. It's not quite as thick, but it's over on Amazon too. Go pick that up. And of course, subscribe on YouTube if you want to learn more about Mojo and AI, and sign up for my newsletter too. Anyways, back to the program here. What I'm going to do with the command line is I'm just going to create a new file by typing in touch_number_guesser.mojo. This creates a new file. Then I'm going to nano it and open it up. And I'm just going to start off with the main method. Now, I'm going to do something a little different here. The main method this time starts off with def. Right before I used fn, this time I'm using def. You can use either one. The only difference is when you use fn, the operations are safe and the typing has to be strict. When you use def, goes back to a more default Python-like syntax, but both are valid. Now, I'm going to declare a variable that's going to hold the magic number that needs to be guessed. And I'm going to declare that by saying let magic number : int equals 5. So even though I've declared this using def, I can still specify my data types inside of the code. Also notice let. The idea of let is that anything that you declare using let becomes a constant. And when you declare variables to be constant, the compiler can do a variety of optimizations. So Python really likes it when you declare a variable to be constant using let. In fact, if you declare a variable as a var, which we're going to do in this next line of code, if you declare a variable using var and you don't actually change the value of that variable during your code, Python will get mad at you. It'll say, hey, you used var to say that was a variable, but it never varies. It's constant. Use let. So Mojo, not Python, Mojo will actually get mad at you. So the next line of code here is to use var and say var guess : int equals 3. So the guess is going to be 3. And then we'll do a little bit of logic here. If the guess equals the magic number, then print out correct, else print sorry, try again. There you go, some logic. If you're a Python programmer, that looks very, very familiar to you. Even if you're a Java programmer or C++ programmer, that looks pretty familiar to you as well. Just a simple program that kind of proves out the logic a little bit. So I'm going to click Control-O. I'm going to click Control-X to get out of nano. Then I'm going to just do an ls to make sure the file's there, numberguesser.mojo, and I'm going to run it. And boom, it works. It works. It actually says, sorry, try again, which is the output that we're expecting. However, got mad at us, right? It said, hey, you used var, and you said var guess, int equals, but var never changed. Like, you're a bad person for using var in that case. Use let. The data's not going to change. If it's not going to vary, don't use var for variable. Use let. So we actually got our wrist slaps a little bit there, but that's kind of interesting. But the program worked. It was just a warning, right? It's not a problem. But let's actually improve this a little bit. Let's get rid of that error, first of all. So I'm going to go into this code, and I'm going to put an octothorpe right before that line of code. And whenever you use an octothorpe, that comments out the line. So that gets rid of that line. And now I'd like to just do this in a loop, right? And you're going to be very familiar with this looping structure. I'm just going to say for guess in range 1, 10. That now allows me to loop through this range of values. And then what happens inside this for loop? Well, I need to indent my logic that gets executed here, right? 4 spaces per indent. I'm going to add a break after the print that says it was correct. That way, when the correct guess occurs, the loop terminates. And I'm just going to indent the rest of the code. And there you go. Now we've got slightly different look to our code here. Nothing too crazy, right? We're using let, we got rid of var. We're using a very familiar looping structure like what you would see in Python, similar with the conditional statements. We're using def instead of fn. So all kind of interesting changes here, but the code is very, very Pythonic. So Control O, Control X to get out of here. I'm then going to come back and say Mojo numberguesser.mojo. The code runs, and then the first 4 iterations it says sorry, try again, and then the 5th iteration it says correct, and then it breaks out of the code. So everything is working correctly. I can even do a quick cat on that code so you can see what it is, and it all looks very, very handsome. And there you go. That's a big overview of Mojo. Again, this wasn't intended to be learn how to program with Mojo. It was more intended to show you how to get it installed, how to get started, how to use the REPL environment, how to write a program, how to build a runnable program, and even how to use some of the new features of Mojo along with the traditional features we would always use with Python, as demonstrated in this little example there. So there you go. Now, I hope you learned a thing or two. As I said, I'm going to be putting out a lot of content on Mojo. So if you want to keep track, please subscribe on YouTube. I am the editor-in-chief over at theserverside.com. We got lots of great content about Java, Mojo, Python, Scrum, Agile, DevOps, AI, you name it. And of course, if you want to follow me on Twitter and keep up with my personal antics, the handle's @CameronMCNZ. But otherwise, until we meet again, happy Mojo.